Okay. So I always like offering in my intro classes an opportunity to go over Eastern philosophy. What we've been doing in this class up until this point has been just looking at kind of Western ideas and concepts, Western figures, Western schools. And I think that makes sense, given that we live in the Western world, given that our history has been informed by these ideas. But philosophy is so much bigger than what people in the West have said and studied. There are deep spiritual, philosophical, and religious traditions going way back in other parts of the world. I'm not going to be able to give you an overview of all those different views today, but y'all chose to look into Buddhism. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. As you'll see, this is a very different way of thinking and a different philosophy of life that Buddhism encourages compared to some of those Western views that we've looked at so far. The Pisan Glendinning, Epicurus, and existentialism, which I'm not going to test you on, but which is cool to know. So look into that if you're interested. The figure that I asked you to read for today is Stephen Lamachus, who is somebody who works in comparative philosophy and religion. I believe he's actually teaching in my home state of Minnesota at the University of St. Thomas. And he's somebody who has a good amount of expertise on Buddhism and other Eastern philosophical schools. This guy isn't so important as the ideas that we're going to be looking at today, but I always think it's a little helpful to give you a little peek behind the curtain with regards to who you're actually reading in this class, which is what I've been trying to do this whole time. In any case, today what we're going to do is we're going to look at Buddhism as Lamachus understands it. We're going to compare it with some of the other views that we've been looking at. And hopefully today you'll come away with another perspective on how you can think about things and how you can live. Maybe a way that you might find useful that could help you cultivate some more peace and happiness in your life. Obviously, there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of issues that we're all struggling with, that we're all working through. The philosophy of life that we're looking at today is one that people have been using for thousands of years in order to deal with the sufferings of life. Maybe you'll find something within it that is wise and, well, applicable to your own life, hopefully. This is just one Eastern school of thought. There are a lot of others. You could look into Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism. There are different kinds of Buddhism as well. We're not going to be going through all the different schools. So if you're interested in this way of thinking, I'd highly encourage you to do some more research and investigation yourself. I have a few lectures on some of these on my YouTube channel, actually. People disagree about what exactly this philosophy of life is. Some people call it a religion. Some people call it just a school of thought. Some people just consider it to be common sense. I'm going to call it a philosophy of life in this class because it gives us, again, another thing to aim at, another guiding star, and a certain set of principles and ideas that we should think about and move through if we're going to attain some kind of happiness and fulfillment in our lives. So, like the other philosophies of life that we looked at, it's going to have a particular view of the world. It's going to encourage a particular set of practices, and it's going to insist on the responsibility, you might say, of the individual to kind of cultivate their own happiness. Now, if you know anything about Buddhism, you know that its ideas are based on the life and teachings of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. This was a guy who lived around 536 BC, and he's somebody whose life is very interesting. and somebody who went on to formulate teachings and ideas that have, well, influenced Eastern peoples for thousands of years now. He was born to a king, so he was a prince, somebody who was born into royalty, who had all of the wealth and power and opportunities that one could dream of. It was said that when he was born, it was prophesied that he was either going to be a great king or something like a great spiritual teacher. Well, we know how that turned out, if you know anything about this Eastern school. For the majority of his childhood, he was sheltered from the sufferings of the world. His father, the king, was somebody who wanted to shield him from death and starvation and all of those things that normal people might have to deal with, pain and suffering. And so he kind of built a protective bubble around his son. And he tried to make it so that no harm would ever come to him, so that he never saw anything bad, so that he only knew happiness and comfort and fulfillment. Well, Siddhartha had a deep longing in his heart to understand what the world was like outside of the palace. And so when he was 16, he ventured outside of the palace. Despite his father's efforts to try to make the way clear to the little village that he was going to scrape away all of the sufferings that he might see on the way there, Siddhartha encountered a sick person, an elderly person, and a funeral caravan, it is said. These were the first encounters that he ever had with sickness and disease and death in his life. And he was kind of shaken up by this. This is something that he'd never seen before. He didn't exactly know that this is what the world was like outside of the palace walls. And so, after this experience, he ended up leaving the palace, leaving his wife, leaving his child, in order to understand the nature of reality and try to figure out how it is that he might attain some peace and happiness in his life, despite the fact that the sufferings of the world are things that every person has to deal with and that he would have to deal with, since he realized that he too would get sick and, well, die one day. And so he spent a number of years trekking around, going from guru to guru, spiritual teacher to spiritual teacher, trying to figure this stuff out. Trying to figure out, how am I supposed to live? What does this all mean? How can I attain peace and happiness? For a time, he was under the tutelage of a group of ascetics who taught that the way to peace and happiness is to deny the needs of the flesh, to deny material comforts, to live a rather, well, simplistic life. He tried that for a little while, but it didn't end up working for him. So now he had had experiences knowing what luxury and decadence was like in the palace, and he had experiences knowing what asceticism was like, and lack, and starvation, you could say, because these people actually starved themselves in order to attain a certain clarity in the mind. What he found is that, at least for him, a middle path between these two extremes was what was going to get him to peace and contentment. And it is said that he sat down in a meditative state under the Bodhi tree, and he attained enlightenment. He experienced a kind of mental state, psychological state that was of deep peace and contentment and happiness in the world. And though at first he was reluctant to teach others about what he had discovered, he did eventually go on to take on students and teach and travel and lecture. And his teachings are still with us today. So what exactly did he discover? Well, we're going to go through it more here in a little bit. But Buddhism, as is the case with a lot of Eastern schools, is going to emphasize thinking and living a little bit differently than we do in the West. One of the things that the Buddha came to realize was that suffering is a natural part of the world, that suffering is going to happen to us, we're going to have to endure it. But so much of that suffering is due to our orientation, it's due to our mindset, and it's due for our innate attachments and desire to things. Like your reputation being good, like your parents not being disappointed in you, like your thirst for material comforts in artificial things. And so we could say generally that Buddhism is going to encourage us to recognize what the human condition is like, truthfully and honestly, the fact of suffering in our lives, and get us to change our mindset with respect to it. That's what it's going to be about. And instead of encouraging us to strive after wealth or power, money, materiality, it's going to say if you can cultivate the right mindset, it doesn't matter what your life is like materially, you can find happiness and you can cultivate joy yourself. Lamachus encourages us to see the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, as a doctor. And so the way that he speaks about him in this piece is he says, what the Buddha is trying to do is diagnose what is wrong with us and what is wrong with the world, and offering us a prescription or a solution to those ills that we face. Now, the interesting thing about Buddhism, as is the case with Taoism as well, is that it admits of a lot of different kinds of metaphysical views and a lot of different practices. Really, what it's going to kind of encourage, broadly speaking, is do what works for you. We're going to give you some general guidelines here to cultivate joy, cultivate contentment, but the way that you live and do that might not be exactly the same as the way other people do that. And so in that way, a lot of people have kind of combined some of the central ideas of Buddhism with other philosophies of life and other religions. It can kind of mesh with these other things. And so what we see in the history of comparative philosophy is this kind of syncretism, this kind of synthesis. Any questions so far? Okay, let's keep going. There are a few different fundamental concepts that I'd like to go over, and then I'd like to introduce you to more of what this Buddha guy said, who admitted he was a human being, somebody who did attain enlightenment, but he never asked anybody to worship him. He didn't think he was a god, and the Buddhists still recognize this today. In any case, he put forth a few different foundational metaphysical concepts or theories about the nature of reality. The first of these we might want to go over is called samsara. Samsara is this word, this concept that is supposed to symbolize for us the cyclical nature of reality. According to a lot of Buddhists, the universe is caught up in a particular cycle of birth, life, death, and reincarnation. Depending on which sect or school of Buddhism that you look into, they're going to have different views about how important this is to escape from or how much hold it has over us. Some schools of Buddhism think that there are different realms that we can exist within and be reincarnated into. Some Buddhists think that depending on how you live your life and what your mindset is like, that's going to largely determine what you come back as, whether that is a human or an animal or somebody who's further along the enlightened path. In any case, the general idea is this. We are caught up in this cycle, and generally the goal of Buddhism is to become liberated, moksha, from this cycle, to escape this endless cycle that we're caught up in. What drives the cycle is karma. And no, we're not talking about Taylor Swift. No, we're not talking about Jojo Siwa. We're talking about an ancient concept. It basically means fruits. The idea is basically this. The kinds of thoughts that you have, the things that you say, the actions that you engage in, you can think of them as little seeds that end up sprouting into different kinds of plants. The seeds that you plant then are going to influence not only your own life, but other people's lives as well. Speaking kind and compassionate words is going to be like planting good seeds that are going to bear good, helpful fruit. Saying mean things to people might come back to bite you in the butt, or it might make other people's lives worse. Some people simplify this idea and they say that, what this idea means is if you do a bad thing is going to happen to you. It's not exactly it. That's kind of an oversimplification. The idea is just generally that the things that we do, the words that we say, the processes that we engage in, is what keeps the cycle going and what plays a large role in determining how our lives end up for us. And you can see that there's a kind of truth or wisdom in this, right? The things that you do end up becoming your habits. The things that are your habits end up determining your character. And your character is going to determine, how you see yourself, how you treat others, how you move within the world, whether or not you are pushing the world one step towards heaven or one step towards hell, right? The reason why we engage in these karmic actions is due to desire, as we'll see, or tanha. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Another idea that Lamachus brings up is pratitya samutpada. And this is very similar to another central tenet in Taoism, which you could basically simplify as kind of all things arise together. In Taoism, this concept is symbolized is not the right word. The phrase for it is shisheng sheng, mutual arising. And it's supposed to clue us into the fact that the things and events in our universe are kind of mutually interdependent and interconnected with each other. It's not as if the things that exist in reality exist in a vacuum. Rather, what exists in causal relationship with the other things. So the actions that you engage in are going to have ripple effects on the world outside of you. What is going on outside of your body also is going to influence how everything else works. In other words, everything is kind of connected in a fundamental way. What something means, how something works, is influenced by kind of everything else. And this is how it works all at once, all the time, if you were to look at anything or any event. Finally, one more concept I'd like to relay to you is that of anatman, which basically means no self. In contrast to the Christian view, which says that we all have an immaterial soul that makes us who we are, a distinct essence, a distinct spirit that is again, separate from everybody else, that is our own, that makes up our personal identity, that is unchanging and eternal, the Buddhists are going to say, that's not actually the case. We don't have some permanent self or soul that is unchanging. In some sense, they're going to agree with the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who once said, "A man can never step in the same river twice, because he is not the same man and it is not the same river." And what he meant by that was that everything in the universe is kind of in flux and changing. Nothing is permanent and lasting. So you could imagine that we kind of exist within this giant field of change and transformation of various processes. The same thing is true about what makes us who we are. We are a bundle of changing perceptions and ideas and feelings and thoughts. We don't have a permanent, unchanging soul. Rather, we're a collection of processes. Your body is changing second by second. Your mind is changing second by second. You are a collection of these things in flux. And so that, they're going to say, implies something kind of liberatory about our existence on earth. Even if our lives might be bad, well, things are going to change. Things are always changing. So we can find some peace and respite in the fact that though we may deal with suffering in our life, it's not something that's going to be permanent. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Does anybody have any questions about these ideas? Okay. Now, it's going to vary from school to school or sect to sect what the different Buddhists emphasize, the different practices that they encourage, the kind of specific worldviews that they offer. But generally speaking, they're all united on a few fundamental ideas and perspectives. One of those ideas is this one of Maya. What the Buddhists are going to say is that, in some sense, the world outside of our own minds is illusory. Not that it is fake, but that it doesn't have the same reality as our own inner worlds. It doesn't have the same reality, you might say, as consciousness. This presumption that the stuff outside of us is more real than what's going on in here, or mind or consciousness, causes us to, well, really become entrenched in the world, right? We worry about, what's going on out there, society, money, am I going to be able to get a good job, all these different things. But what Buddhism is going to insist upon, generally speaking, is so much of our reality is constructed and conditioned by our own minds. And so in some fundamental sense, the reality that we live and move within is a construction of consciousness. Not that it is not real, not that it is fake, but it is conditioned by our mindsets, by our thoughts, by our perspectives. And so what they're going to emphasize is, if you want to find contentment and happiness, you got to do stuff in here. You have to work on yourself mentally. Doing all of the physical stuff out there, getting all the power in the world or the status or the fame, that's not going to bring you happiness. Why? Well, because the way that you see the world and how it impacts you is largely determined by the mindset that you bring to it and your orientation. It says in the Dhammapada, in the first passage, that the mind is the forerunner to all things. And this is just basically another way of repackaging what I just said. In the West, we're conditioned to look outside of ourselves and see these material objects as things that are separate from us, that have nothing to do with humans. Right? Oh, look at here. We have some tape. We have a microphone. We have a pen. But what is a pen? Did this just sprout up from the ground? No, this was something that was at first in the human mind and then created, right? So what this thing is fundamentally a human construct, right? And a construct that is formed and laden with certain ideas, certain concepts, you might say. That's how it was created. That's the technique that was used. We're sitting within a building that was a construct of the human mind, right? The laptop in front of you is a construct of the human mind, which is not to say that, again, it's just in your head, but that what is out there in the world, so much of it is influenced and determined by first what's in here. And so if we can change how our minds work, if we can change what our attention is on, our perspective, our mindset, all of this stuff is going to look different to us. And the way that we experience reality is also going to be different. Oh. Looks like I forgot the picture there. Oh well. So, in contrast, you might say, to Christianity, which is going to say, if you want to find salvation, you have to place your faith and trust in God, in the triune God that exists outside of you, and depend on Him. Buddhism is going to say, if you want to find contentment and happiness, you really have to do the inner work. It's going to place the onus of responsibility for joy on the individual person. The Buddhists are going to say having all the stuff in the material world isn't going to make you happy if your mindset isn't right. You're not going to find contentment if you're constantly grasping for things. You're not going to find happiness if you've conditioned yourself into looking at the world in a pessimistic way. So, what they're going to encourage, and we're going to get to the practices in a little bit, is, again, a reconceptualization of our own existence and of the world. And they're going to give us a few different practices to engage in or things to focus on that we can use to undergo a transformation. This is a philosophy that's meant to be lived. This isn't a philosophy that's just meant to be thought about while you're sitting in your leather armchair in your study all day. It's meant to be put into practice so that you can undergo a kind of transformation that is going to help you and liberate you from a lot of the problems, struggles, and sufferings that you're enduring right now. Now, as Lamachus notes, Buddha used the vehicle of the Four Noble Truths to transmit his teachings to his students. These Four Noble Truths contain Siddhartha's general understanding of reality and the human condition, what causes it, the nature of that condition, and how we can escape it. The first noble truth is called the truth of suffering. And this truth basically says, suffering dukkha, exists in the world. You experience suffering. We all experience suffering. Maybe you're experiencing it right now, having to be in this room, listening to this lecture. You experience it when you don't want to get out of bed in the morning because it's so nice and cozy and warm. Like I was this morning. Because you have to go out. The window's open and it's cold and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. You experience sickness. You experience heartache. You want your love to be reciprocated. And it always isn't, right? Maybe people make fun of you. Maybe people say things that really hurt your feelings. Maybe you have had traumatic experiences. This is not a pessimistic view. The Buddha is just trying to tell us suffering is a part of this world that we experience. A lot of people would say this is just a realistic view, right? Suffering's a part of your life, and you will experience it in the future. You will grow old. Your capacities will decline. And eventually you're going to die. This is what happens to everybody. This is what we're swimming in. We're living in a world in which suffering is something that we endure. But more so than that, it's not just something that happens to us, it's something that we're all also contributing to. You might not realize it, but through your speech and through your actions, you've caused suffering to other people, right? Maybe you've broken someone's heart. Maybe you said something that has hurt their feelings, caused them to be insecure, right? Maybe you start a violent disagreement on accident in your house, right? And things get heated. You bring up politics at Thanksgiving. And so you're contributing not only to other people's suffering, not only are other people contributing to your suffering, we're all also contributing to our own suffering. How? Well, we get caught up in these ideas about what's going to make us happy, about what we need, worries about the past and the future, regrets and anxieties. If we could use the language of the psychoanalysts, we have what's called an ego. We have this thing that, well, it has feelings and desires and certain perspectives on the world, and we get caught up within it, right? And that ego that you have, well, it gets upset when it doesn't get what it wants, right? It wants the world to be a certain way. It wishes it could impose its image of the world on what is outside of itself and make everything according to that image. And so by living in the past or the future, through the things we say, through the things we do, through these messed up perspectives that we have, we're contributing to the suffering in the world and perpetuating this cycle that we are living within. We're planting those seeds, right? The second noble truth is supposed to locate the cause of this suffering that we experience. Well, I kind of clued you into it with my comments a few moments ago, but the Buddhists are going to say that it's fueled by ignorance and desire. Or, if you don't like that word desire, another one might be possessiveness or attachment or literally thirst. That's what tanha means. You thirst for things, right? What do you thirst for? Well, not just a drink when you're thirsty, right? You long for food. You long for your alone time in your dorm room, right? You long for meaningful human relationships. You long for somebody to love you and want you, right? And pursue you. You long for a certain job. You long for psychological security. You long for your parents to say, "I'm proud of you." You long for a certain life, maybe kids, maybe a husband or wife or whatever. We have all these longings, all these desires. Likewise, we have a bunch of attachments to things. Reflect on your own personal life right now. What are you attached to? What does your mind focus on? What are you yearning after? Are you attached to getting an A in this class? Are you attached to your pet? Would you be devastated if they died? Are you attached to your water bottle? Would you cry if you lost that? We have all these attachments to things. But it is fundamentally this thirst for things that causes us to act in ways that are karmic. This leads us into the third noble truth, which is supposed to clue us into, well, how can we eliminate the suffering in our lives? How can we find that ultimate peace and contentment that we're looking for, such that we're not suffering? It's by eliminating that thirst, or by eliminating desire. That's what this third truth is all about, the truth of the end of suffering. Because you have desires for things, because you thirst and you long for things, that causes you to think in certain ways and do certain things. Right? Maybe you're on the road and you're running late for class, and so you have a desire to get to class. And what do? Well, in order to fulfill that desire, you're speeding along and you're cutting people off and you're running yellows. Right? Your desires for things compel you to do things. But we know that if you don't get what you want, if anybody doesn't get what they want, that often upsets them, right? They have a certain expectation about how the world is going to work, about how their life is going to go. If that doesn't come to fruition, people get upset. They feel anxiety. They feel fear. And so what the Buddha realized and tried to teach his students is your attachments to the things of this world, to your pets, to a certain life, to a certain job, to a certain goal, your desires, your longings for various things, whether it's love, relationships, money, a certain video game, all of that stuff causes you to engage in these thought patterns and actions that harm yourself and others. Maybe not immediately, but in some indirect sense at least. Let's say, for example, that you do have a thirst to get an A in this class. What's going to happen to you if you don't get an A? You're going to be upset. You're going to be sad, right? You're going to beat yourself up. Would you feel any suffering if you could eliminate that desire to get an A? No. Right? You would just accept the result, whatever it was, because you don't really care. You wouldn't be upset about it. So if it's true that our desires cause us to do things that make our lives worse, mentally and physically, and make other people's lives worse, the Buddha says, if you can figure out how to eliminate your attachments to things, your desire for things, you're not going to suffer. In some sense, then, what Buddhism is going to encourage is a kind of radical acceptance of what is going on. Not being attached to certain ideas about how the world should work. Not thinking about, oh, I want my future to be this way, I got to worry about all this, or oh, I regret all this stuff in the past. But living presently in the eternal now, free from your attachments to all of this stuff. Objects, goals, projects, relationships, etc. How can this be done? Well, the Fourth Noble Truth gives us another clue through what the Buddha called the Eightfold Path. We can transcend our desires, our attachments to things, by engaging in a certain lifestyle. By changing the way that we think, by changing our perspective, by changing how we speak and how we act and how we treat ourselves and other people. That will allow us to transcend this thirst that we have for things that produces the suffering in our lives. I know this sounds silly, but there's a certain truth in what I'm about to say to you. One of the things that we talked about in the last class was death. Or when we talked about Epicurus, we talked about how people are worried about dying, right? And this is something that everybody's going to experience. Maybe you're worried about it. Would death be a problem to you if you were no longer attached to living? Would you worry about dying if you didn't care, if you weren't attached to being alive? That's kind of taken this idea to its extreme, but you can imagine how, well, no, death wouldn't concern me at all if I wasn't attached to being alive. That's kind of the general idea. Now, I'm not encouraging you to think or act in this way, but I'm giving you a perspective. This is a perspective. It's a perspective in your toolbox. Think about it. Work out what you think is right. Work out how it is that you think you should live. Okay, but onwards towards the Eightfold Path. What is that? Well, the Buddha said, if you want to transcend your desires, transcend your attachments to things, and therefore escape suffering, there are 8 things that you need to focus on. 8 things that you need to embody. And they are the following. Right thought or view. Right speech. Right action. Right livelihood, that is what you do for a living. The activities that you engage in. Right effort. Right mindfulness, and right concentration. I'll break these down each a little bit more because it might not be obvious, just like it might not have been obvious when we talked about Aristotle, what it means to think, speak, and act virtuously or excellently. But the idea is pretty much the same. Intuitively, you kind of understand what these mean. Right view, what is that? Well, of course, the Buddhists are going to say, having the proper understanding of this reality that you live in. It's basically recognizing the truths of the Four Noble Truths. You live in a reality in which there's suffering. That suffering is caused by desire. You can eliminate suffering by transcending your desire. And you can do that by, well, changing how you think, speak, and act, and how you see things. So, if you want to start out on this Eightfold Path, the first thing that you need to do is change your perspective on how the world works and what's happening and what's going on. Because we all have certain ideas about this, but they're misleading in various ways. And they don't relate to us the truth of what's going on. So first, you need to get the correct perspective. Recognize and embody the correct perspective. Then you need to engage in right thought. What is that? Well, it has to do with changing your thought processes and your thought patterns. You'll be familiar with this if you've ever gone through cognitive behavioral therapy. There are certain thought patterns and processes that we get caught up in, right? Maybe you ruminate on certain things. Maybe you have a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen to you in the next 5 minutes. Maybe you have anxiety about how this phone call is going to go because now you got to call your tax guy and you're not so good on the phone. You got phone anxiety. The Buddhists are going to say, slowly try to change those thought patterns. Change those thought processes that lead to your own suffering. Change the thought processes that lead to you doing things that hurt other people. Okay, so that's the second thing. Right speech. This one's pretty self-explanatory, right? Don't lie. Don't slander people. Speak with compassion and love. Speak with a certain acceptance and tolerance. Basically, don't be a dick with your words, right? But that includes not just other people, that includes yourself. I bet there are some of you in this room that engage in a lot of negative self-talk. I do the same thing. When you do something wrong that you see as wrong, where does the first thing your mind goes to? Oh, stupid fucking. Why did you do that? Buddhism is going to say, you got to change that, right? Look at how you're beating yourself up with your own thoughts and your own speech. That's not cool. You're just causing yourself suffering. So you got to change that. Then we have right action. Again, a lot of the Buddhists are going to be big on this compassion and love thing. Because, like some of the existentialists, they're going to say, what you need to recognize in order to find some peace and contentment is that everybody is kind of in this together and we're all fellow sufferers on this journey of life. If you can recognize and embody that idea, you'll be on your way to doing things that actually improve your own life and improve other people's lives, and things that don't tear them down or make their lives worse, right? Maybe when somebody cuts you off on the road, what you want to do is speed ahead of them and slam on your brakes. But that's just going to cause more conflict, right? A good Buddhist perhaps would smile and be like, oh, they must be having a bad day. They cut me off. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to retaliate. Because I don't know what good is going to come from retaliation in that kind of instance. They might end up following you home and pulling their gun out or something because people are crazy, especially on the road. In any case, the general idea is this. You got to change the way that you act so that you're showing yourself and others compassion. So that you're building yourself and others up. You're not tearing them down. Not being mean. Buddhism is also going to encourage that the way that you do your job should follow certain virtuous principles. What does that mean? Well, probably don't get a job being a hitman. That probably isn't going to lead to a peaceful and contentful life for you, right? Maybe don't get a job shaking down people that owe debts to others. That's probably not going to lead to contentment for you, right? The activities that you engage in, your livelihood that you engage in so that you need to survive, make sure that you're doing it in the right way. That you're not doing things that, are going to harm yourself or others. Physically or mentally, right? Say you're a checkout person, right? I used to work at Kmart when Kmarts were still around. You can do that job in a way that is friendly and nice, right? Or you could do that job in a way in which you're just like, you hate everybody and everything, and everybody can tell. Maybe do it the former way, right? Do it with a patience, with a grace, with a compassion. Right effort. What is that? Well, it's about your commitment to the path. If you're actually going to find contentment and happiness and joy, it's something that you have to work on. It's not just going to come to you willy-nilly. The universe isn't just going to hand it to you. Again, Buddhism is going to be big on this necessity of inner transformation if you're going to find that peace and happiness that you're looking for. But you are not transformed, right? You haven't made it yet. You haven't reached enlightenment. You got to put in the work. You got to put in the time. You got to put in the energy. You got to be committed to changing your life, how you think, speak, and act in these various ways. And you actually got to put it into practice. No amount of just thinking about it is going to do you good, right? You actually have to do it. Just like we saw in Aristotle, right? Ethical knowledge is not enough to become a good and healthy person. You actually got to do the stuff. You got to put yourself in situations in which you can practice doing that stuff and get used to it and make it a part of your character or make it a part of your very being. Mindfulness, that has to do with, again, recognizing where you are on the path, being mindful of how you might improve, how you might not be doing everything perfectly, where you might want to shift your energy or your effort to better walk down this road. In a certain sense, what it means is, pay attention to what you're doing, what's working, what's not working, where you're at. And then finally, we have concentration. And this is similar to effort, but it has more to do with your mental state, your attention. You have to focus your attention on the right things. So, again, if you become mindful of where you might be lacking, you place your concentration on improving that area, on improving that aspect of your life, right? If you actually want to become peaceful and happy, you need to direct your attention to that pursuit. Not to this thing over here or not to that thing over there, but directing it and focusing on and pursuing the path. In other words, generally speaking, again, to find that joy, to cultivate that joy in your life, you have to change how you see things and how you do things. And these different aspects are like the Aristotelian virtues. They're kind of mutually interdependent and they reinforce one another. Let's just take one example. You're working on, actually speaking with love and compassion and patience. How might that impact some of these other aspects? Well, if you change your speech, that might also influence how you see yourself. Right? If you're always saying negative things, things that tear others down and things that tear yourself down, well, that's not so good. But if you are saying more positive things, that might reinforce some positive thought processes and patterns and ideas of yourself in your head. If you do good things, that may influence you to have, again, thoughts and engage in speech that are more virtuous, that are more benevolent and compassionate. If you engage in a certain job and you're doing that appropriately, lovingly, compassionately, well, that's going to influence how much effort you can put towards improving yourself and all of these things. Right? Because you can imagine that if you're not working the right job, if you're working a job that drains you, if it's not adding to your life, if you're forced to do these things that you find are morally questionable, that's not going to give you much energy to, well, improve the other aspects of your life, right? Maybe you feel this already. You work your job and then you come home and the only thing that you want to do is turn your brain off and watch Netflix for 5 hours until you pass out. Instead of going to the gym or instead of making yourself a healthy meal, you order takeout because you don't have to deal with that, right? So these are kind of mutually reinforcing. And engaging in all of them allows us to proceed through this transformation of our mental states, of our perspectives, of our ideas about ourselves. Okay, that's kind of theoretical. I gave you a few examples of how you might do that in practice, but we can talk about that a little bit more here. In order to escape suffering, to find joy, to find contentment, we might offer the following brief sketch. The Buddhists are going to say, well, you got to commit yourself to this view, to this understanding of the universe and your place within it. You need to direct your thoughts and emotions to what they're going to call the middle way, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Not living a life of hedonistic overindulgence and pleasure, not living a life of pure asceticism where you deny yourself everything and you starve yourself and you just sit in a cave alone meditating all day. But the path between these two extremes. Giving your body what it needs, but not giving it all of the material comforts in the world, because you don't need that. And you might become dependent on that stuff. As we said before, once you start thinking about and directing your thoughts and emotions to this middle path between the two extremes, start changing how you speak to people. Please and thank you. How are you? Are you doing okay? Oh, that's a wonderful dress you have on. But actually mean it, don't just say empty words. Oh, that was an awesome thing you said. Will you tell me more? And direct that also to yourself, right? Maybe you need to stand in front of the mirror and do some positive affirmations, right? You are beautiful. I love you, as you're talking to yourself in the mirror. I don't know, maybe that'll help. Have you ever tried it? Alongside this, act virtuously. Be honest, kind, and compassionate to others. Give people grace. Be patient. Be tolerant. One of the things that Buddhism is big on is, not trying to force their views down anybody's throat. Because they're just kind of like, well, I think I know what works for me, and I think this would work for other people, but, some people they don't want to hear it, they're not ready, whatever. Like, yeah, they're going through their stuff. Like, I'm going to keep doing this. This seems to be working out well. Buddhism would encourage you to pick up a job that isn't, evil. Obviously, we all need to make a living, and we might have to take up a job that we don't think is perfectly moral, right? I don't know if you think working at a shop in the mall is perfectly moral. Probably not. But there are ways that you can do your job in which you spread compassion, in which you treat others right, in which you can feel proud at the end of the day that you did well, in a way that you don't violate your morals. That's important. But to find this peace and contentment, you can't half-ass it. Okay? Again, it's something that you got to put the time and energy and effort into, which is what is meant by be fully committed and mindful to development along the path. If you spend all your time thinking about video games, you spend all your time, listening to Taylor Swift's new album, instead of improving your thoughts and improving your speech and action, well, you're not going to progress, right? And things aren't going to get better. So you got to be committed to this thing. You got to be committed to your own self-improvement, your own positive moral and psychological transformation. In order to help yourself along that, you continuously try to cultivate motivation for that improvement, for that transformation. You cultivate mental awareness of your situation. How far along are you in this? How have you been doing? Again, are there things you can improve? Are there any good ideas that other people are using or that they've said to you that you can incorporate? Is there a better way you could be looking at these things? Trying to remain open-minded and aware of that stuff. And finally, hopefully, you can get to the point where you cultivate a calmness and collectedness throughout your experience in life. Somebody who doesn't freak out when the sufferings of life come down on them. Things aren't always going to go the way that you want them to, right? Things are going to be tough. But again, because all is in flux, all is changing, it's not going to be that way forever. Cultivate a calmness through this stuff. Don't let yourself be taken over by those emotions and passions that lead to karmic thought and action. This is why a lot of Buddhists will engage in meditation, because it helps the cultivation of some of these things. Of awareness, of attention, of calmness, collectedness, etc. Towards this end, this is why the Buddha encouraged what is called the middle way. He saw these two different kinds of life that a person could live. Remember, in the palace, he had everything that he could ever want, all the material comforts, all the pillows, all the good food. But that stuff didn't lead him to a deeper understanding of the nature of reality and his condition. Nor did leaving the pure privation lifestyle, the lifestyle of asceticism that some monks and some saints throughout history have engaged in, where they've denied themselves food and water for days and weeks, and they, would stand up just on these pillars, just meditating the whole time. The Buddha tried that, and he was skin and bones by the end of it, and he's like, I'm no closer to being happy. Yeah, I learned some cool breath work and some meditation, but my body is like a skeleton. And so kind of like Aristotle's view, you could imagine this philosophy of life is going to encourage a certain kind of balance, a certain kind of balanced lifestyle. Morally speaking, between mindless self-indulgence and over-deprivation of everything. Between those two extremes. Epistemologically, or when it comes to what you know and what you pursue and knowledge and truth, between ignorance and closed-mindedness, you don't want to be like that. You don't want to assume you have all the answers and you're going to shut everyone else and everything out. Nor do you just want to accept everything that society tells you and believe that it's true. Middle path between these two things. Using your own capacities and your own faculties to, well, remain open-minded, but reflect on the stuff and think about it and integrate what works and pick that up. And if something doesn't work, you toss it out. And finally, we might say metaphysically, between being and non-being, as Lamacus says. Being, you might say, implies a certain static existence, an unchanging existence. Non-being implies nothingness. You don't want to be nothing. You don't want to be static. You can't be static because your body's changing, your mind is changing. You want to be in the middle, in becoming. As a part of this process, as a part of this flux, this changing nature of the universe. And so to summarize, Buddhism is going to say, it's up to you to cultivate that joy, peace, and happiness that you're looking for. It's not something that can come from without. It has to come from within. How do you do that? Well, you change your inner world. You change what's going on in here. Because so much of your suffering comes from this. How you're seeing things and how you're thinking about things. There are certain practices that you can engage in to affect positive change in that realm. But you can, in a paradoxical way, get too attached to trying to live like this, which is another interesting thing. You should work on not forming an attachment to these ideas either too much. But living in the present, not worrying about the future or the past, showing compassion to others and showing compassion to yourself. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy summarizes it this way. The proper lifestyle is balanced, in which one, quote, renounces all mental states that generate suffering for oneself and others. Some people have this idea that obtaining nirvana or enlightenment is like a binary thing. It's either you've done it or you haven't. But a better way to think about it is it's a process. There are degrees of enlightenment. You should be continuing towards more enlightenment. It's a process. It's something you have to move through and work through. This isn't something that you're just going to attain one day and then you'll be enlightened forever. It's something that you got to work on, something that you got to put energy into. Thus, we might say, like Aristotle's philosophy, like his ethics, this is one which encourages changing how we're living so that we can better deal with this stuff and so that we can find contentment. It's just couched in some different concepts, some different metaphysics, etc. Different historical time period, culture, traditions, so on and so forth. So what do you think about this view? Does this view resonate with you at all? Or not?
I think it makes sense for the most part on like how to live a calm and peaceful life.
Okay.
But does it really answer like our meaning?
Ah.
That's how we might really consider it.
That's a good question. I mean, you say meaning. What does that mean? What are you looking for?
Like our main drive, I guess.
Our main drive. Well, what do you think our main drive is? Is it not happiness?
Depends on the person. Like some people
Yeah.
think towards happiness, others are materialistic.
Yeah, I mean, Buddhism is going to say, yeah, we've been conditioned in all these different ways to want all these different things. They would say the people who have been conditioned into wanting that material stuff, well, unfortunately, that ain't the path that they should go down. You know, they've been put on the wrong path. I think it would depend on the Buddhist that you talk to. But some of them might say, if you have an attachment to having some sort of purpose, well, that's something you should try to dissolve, you know. Unless it doesn't bring you suffering, you know, and unless it's good for you, you know. But yeah, maybe you think, maybe this life is good for peace, but maybe it's not good for meaning or fulfillment. Maybe you think fulfillment is different than peace. I don't know. That's something worth meditating on. Yeah?
I kind of agree. Like, I think it's good to look at it as, okay, I need to look more in the present moment.
Yeah.
But I kind of agree it's not like, what's the word that I was going to use? My mind blank. I feel like it doesn't really have like a purpose or a meaning as well, because like for those people, are you going to try as much like in life towards like whether it's your classes or what you want to do after college or whatever. And I know that they're saying you shouldn't worry about that as much, but are you going to get as much out of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Whenever I teach this Eastern stuff like Buddhism and Taoism, one of the things that I often ask students is, do you think this way of thinking and acting is compatible with how we see and do things in the Western world? And a lot of them say no. And there's some truth to that, because the way that we think and the way that we set up our society is different from Chinese society or Malaysian society, right? Our metaphysics is different. Our priorities are different. Right? And so I don't know what that implies. I don't know if that implies there's something wrong with these views or if there's something wrong with what we're doing. But it's worth thinking about, right? Any final comments, questions? Okay. Well, then I'll let you go. Thank you for coming. I hope you all found this interesting. I'll send you all that link to our optional review session soon. It'll be on Tuesday during class time. So if you have any questions about any of the material or you need clarification on anything, write that stuff down and then ask it on Tuesday. Okay? I'm not going to go over everything with you. I'm going to answer your questions. Okay, thank you.